Okay, hi everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started because it's 6. Thank you all for coming to the second in the Fossils Rock lecture series with Kallie from UM's Paleontology Department. We've got some handouts at the front that list all of the programs coming up in the series. So please grab one of those and leave us comments if you've got other programs you'd like to see.
All right, thank you everybody for coming here. I heard Glacial Lake Missoula chapter is here. Is that right? And raise your hand. Nice. All right. Well, hopefully this will not be new information for you guys. So this is one of my favorite talks. I originally created this for Lone Pine State Park and only one person showed up, so I doubt they're in the room. So I'm gonna give it again. It's a lot of fun. So we're gonna go back, about 2.6 million years in Montana and look at the glacial features, what is an ice age, and then the animals of the ice age. So winter is coming, but I guess for us right now, it's here officially. It's totally here. I gave this talk in like late fall, so it made a lot more sense then. But winter today is not like winter in the Pleistocene at all. So to the talk today, we're going to start with an overview, the what, when, and why of an ice age. Then we'll go into the animals, lion, tigers, and bears. And then we'll get into the geology, so the landscape that the ice created. So let's jump in with what, when, and why of an ice age. So what is an ice age? So an ice age is simply a long period of decreased temperatures with polar ice sheets. So polar ice sheets form. Thank you so much. So a polar ice sheet is usually something that's like more than 19,000 square miles. That's what an ice sheet is. And you have two periods in an ice age. You have a glacial period where it's an individual cold pulse and the ice is growing. And then you have an interglacial phase where it's an intermittent warm pulse where your ice either retreats or stops growing. So technically today, since we still have ice sheets, we are in an interglacial period of this most previous ice age. So we're still in it. Now, once all of our ice melts, we will officially be out of an ice age. And the amount of ice changes over time. So during Earth's 4.5 billion year history, there have been times when the entire planet was covered in ice, and there were other times when there was little to no ice. So you go from this snowball Earth that we had about 700 million years ago to glacial cycles, and you get your interglacial cycles, and then you have completely ice-free times. So if we look at that in graph form, all of the red is times when there was no ice sheets. There were no polar ice caps. And then the blue times are times with polar ice caps. So you can see that here recently, we've just started into our little ice age here. This is the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum. This is the last time the Earth got super duper hot. And then of course you have the Cretaceous. So the Cretaceous was much hotter than it is today. And then boom, that is near the, that's when Pangaea was here. So this big supercontinent. And the middle of Pangaea was basically too hot even for peat swamps. So you can see we've gone through a lot of cycles of ice and no ice over the last 500 million years, which this graph is showing. So what causes an ice age? Well, it's complicated. And there's a lot of factors that work together, and it's kind of like a cycle, a positive feedback cycle. So you can have orbital variations. This is basically the Milankovitch cycle. So this is our ellipsis as we go around the sun, our wobble, and our tilt. So all of those working together can either make your seasons unusually warm or unusually cold if they work in the right direction. Solar energy, so the amount of sun power coming out of the sun changes. So our sun is on kind of an 11-year cycle. So sometimes we have a whole bunch of solar flares and it's super active, and then it chills out. And it's kind of like whatevs for a few years, and then it comes back around. So that we actually still have cycles with our solar energy output. Plate tectonics can affect the climate. So volcanoes can work in both directions. You can pump stuff into the atmosphere, block out the sun and cool it, or you can just pump in a whole bunch more greenhouse gases and actually warm it up. You have changes in ocean basins and mountain building episodes. So mountain building usually increases erosion, which actually decreases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which can cause cooling. Ocean currents, so changes in the heat transport of our oceans. So you guys are probably familiar that our oceans and our atmospheres are very closely linked. And so these changes in the ocean circulation can also change climate. For example, Antarctica. We have the circumpolar current that goes around it. And there wasn't a big giant ice cap that covered Antarctica until that current went all the way around it. And now it kind of has its own feedback cycle. And then obviously our atmospheric composition. So again, greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, those can change. The more greenhouse gases, the warmer it is. The less greenhouse gases, the cooler it is. So these all can work in tandem. Not just one thing causes an ice age usually. It's usually most of these things working together, kind of like a perfect storm, and then it'll, excuse me, and then it'll kick off into either an ice age or a really, really hot phase. So let's look at our most recent ice age. And this is the Pleistocene glaciation, and it started around 2.6 million years ago. At its peak, about 30% of Earth's surface was covered in ice. That's a lot, most in the northern hemisphere. The ice sheets were 1 to 2 miles thick, and it resulted in a temporary sea level drop of about 300 feet. So Florida got really big. If you had some real estate in Florida back in the Pleistocene, you'd have a lot. And then it shrunk back down as water levels came up. Now, the mean annual temperature at the edge of the ice was about 21 degrees Fahrenheit, and at the edge of the permafrost was about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was chilly, but it makes sense. There's ice everywhere. So here's a map of kind of what the northern hemisphere looking down on the North Pole. So here's Eurasia and North America, and then all of this is ice, and all of this is sea ice. And the sea ice goes out to about here. It's a little difficult to see on this screen. Okay. So if we look again a little closer at North America, we can see two different times during this glaciation. So this one over here, about 20,000 years ago, is the last glacial maximum. This is the last time the ice came down super duper far into North America. So you can see it comes down all the way past the 40th parallel, where Kansas and Nebraska come together. So I've seen glacial erratics and all sorts of cool glacial features in the Kansas City area, for example. And then about 12,000 years ago is a really important time for us humans, but I want to draw your attention to this corridor right here. And we're going to come back and talk about that. And if we zoom in a little bit more and look just at Montana, Montana had a lot going on during this time period. So this is, let's see, this is probably during the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 to 12,000 years ago. And you can see Montana is just covered in glacial lakes. So the most famous one, at least over here on our side of the state, is Glacial Lake, Missoula, by far. But we also had Glacial Lake Great Falls, the Mussel Shell, Circle, and all the way out to Glendive. So this is the front end of that ice sheet. And anywhere that that ice came down and blocked a major waterway, you get a glacial lake. Also, you can have glacial lakes form just as the ice starts melting, and it just pools up in the depression that the ice sheet made as it advanced forward. So now let's look at Glacial Lake, Missoula. So in between 18,000 and 12,000 years ago, there was an ice lobe that repeatedly blocked the Clark Fork River right here at the Montana-Idaho border. This little bitty ice lobe created all this water. And that backed up the Clark Fork River and basically filled in all of the valleys with water. Now, this didn't happen just one time or two times. This happened probably over 40 times, where it filled up and then catastrophically failed again. So the ice dam itself was about 2,500 feet tall, and the water rose to an elevation about 4,200 feet. So there are three or four markers right here in Missoula that you can hike up to see how high the water line was. Yep, there's a couple on Mount Sentinel, there's one on the back side, there's one on the front side, there's one on Mount Jumbo, and there's one on the new Barmeyer Trail. so you guys can hike up. The Barmeyer one is the easiest one to get to, by the way, if you need an easier trip up to see one of the high water markers. So Glacial Lake was the size of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario combined. This was a lot of water, you guys, a lot of water. And when this ice dam failed, the water had an estimated max flow of about 386 million cubic feet per second. That's like 60 Amazon rivers. That's the flow rate of the water bursting out of this valley. The shocking thing is we think it only took a few days to empty, which is just mind-boggling. Like so much water, just poof, in a couple of days is gone. You go from a lake that is over 4,000 feet in elevation to a dry valley in just a couple of days. Now, as far as we know, there are no fossils or human artifacts associated with the lake or the failure, but native oral history suggests that people were probably around and probably witnessed this, which is, again, wow, human eyes actually saw this happen. So here is the serene view of the lake looking at the ice dam. So this would be in the valley here. This beautiful blue glacial lake. If you've seen any of the beautiful blue glacial lakes in like Yoho National Park or somewhere up there in Banff, that's probably what this would have looked like. Just absolutely gorgeous. On this side of it. Now, if you were on the other side of it, you would have 0.00 seconds to get out of there before you'd be washed away and dead. All right, so now that we got a good background on ice ages and our ice age here in Montana, let's talk about the animals. So we're mainly going to focus on Pleistocene megafauna. And depending on who you ask, a megafauna is something that is over 100 pounds or it's over 2,000 pounds, depending on who you ask. We'll go with 100 pounds today because we can show more animals that way. They migrated all around the world with land bridges. They were found in the Americas, Eurasia, Africa, Australia. Basically every continent had their own megafauna. And they're mostly extinct. So most of them were gone by about 10,000 years ago. So here in Montana, we're actually really, really lucky because we are one of the few states that have both Columbian mammoths and woolly mammoths. And I tried to make the scale down here the same so you can see how much bigger a Columbian mammoth was compared to a woolly mammoth. So Columbian mammoths were mostly southern United States and woolly mammoths were mostly northern United States. And then they came in perfectly right here in Montana where we have both. And the oldest ancient DNA that we have right now is from a Siberian mammoth tooth, and it's 1.65 million years old. So we've actually gotten real DNA from an over million-year-old animal, and that's the oldest right now. But it's from Siberia, not from over here. And the woolly mammoth is probably the last of the megafauna that survived. It held on in high Arctic islands till about 4,000 years ago. So just a reminder, that's when the Great Pyramids of Giza were being built. So as the Egyptians were building their pyramids, there were still woolly mammoths hanging out in the North Pole. We also had another type of elephant called a mastodon. It's in the family Mammutidae. And mastodons are only distantly related cousins, basically, of mammoths and elephants. So if you had mammoths and elephants over here being sisters, this random little lineage over here would be the mastodons. And they shared the last living ancestor, common ancestor, was about 25 million years ago. So they split off pretty early from mammoths and modern elephants. They appear in North America about 5 million years ago, so they were here before the Ice Age started. And they held on until like the late Pleistocene. And they were probably extinct around 10,000 years ago. So it's pretty cool that we have 3 different types of elephants, basically, that lived in Montana. We also had giant ground sloths. So we actually had 2 different species of giant ground sloth, but I'm just going to show you the big one. This is Megalonyx. the famous one that Thomas Jefferson saw the claws from it, and he was like, "It's a giant lion, go find it." It wasn't, it was ground sloth. So you can see here, it does have some pretty serious looking claws, but that's just to pull branches closer to its face while it's eating. Less energy it has to expend to eat. But they were pretty big though. The ancestor of this ground sloth arrived in North America about 7 million years ago. And Megalonyx has the widest distribution in North America of all of the giant ground sloths. Yes. Oh yes, so that was Lewis and Clark. He was like, keep an eye out for this giant lion when Lewis and Clark came out here. And turns out it's a sloth. It's great. We also had the giant short-faced bear, Arctotus. So these were really big bears. So today our biggest bear on the planet is a polar bear, and you can see the short-faced bear stood about a head taller than it. And it was around from about 2.5 million years ago, and it disappears from the fossil record about 12,000 years ago. But it was an enormous omnivore, just like our modern grizzlies. Let me see. Oh yes, the funny thing about this bear is it's not related to these bears. It's actually most closely related to the sun bear of South America. Tremarctinae, that's the family. We did an Eons episode about it if you want to check it out. We have found cave scratches from these bears, and they reach 15 feet up on the wall, and them stretching out and scratching up on the cave walls. So these were huge bears, huge bears. Of course, we had the giant longhorn bison, bison latifrons. The horns on these are just ridiculous to see in person. It doesn't look real how big they were, because right now all we have is the horn core. But there would have been that keratinous sheath that went over the top of it, right? So it would have been even longer than what we have in the skulls. Now what's fun about good old latifrons is that there have been skulls of latifrons found all around Montana. Idaho, Canada, North, South Dakota, Wyoming, but not in Montana. So let me know if you have anybody that has a latifron skull that was actually found in Montana, because it would be great to have record of that. We have lots of postcranial material, like I have feet bones and ankle bones in our collection, but as far as I know, from a bison expert, no skulls of latifrons has been found in Montana. So keep your eyes peeled. Bison are pretty cool because they evolved from a species that crossed the land bridge from Eurasia to North America about 2,400 years ago, somewhere in there. So they're a more recent immigrant into our continent, but they disappeared about 20 to 30,000 years ago. So they were one of the earlier casualties of the Megafauna extinction at the end of the Pleistocene. There are no living descendants of bison latifrons. There are a lot of other species of bison. We have bison, our modern one. There's bison occidentalis. There's bison, there's another one. There's like 3 different species of bison. There's a whole bunch of them. And from genetic work that we've done on them, they were pretty free. They intermingled a lot, if you will, but not bison latifrons. It kept to itself. So it left no modern descendants, and it was on its own little branch, separate from our modern bison. But it is the largest bovid, so cow, basically, that has ever lived. This is the biggest, latifrons. It weighed twice as much as a modern bison. So I remember driving through Yellowstone in a little Ford Ranger, and a bison came up and tried to stick its tongue in our window, but the hump of that bison was taller than my Ford Ranger. And this thing was about twice as big as it. So that's a really big cow. We also had muskox, which that was one of the coolest things that I learned about when I first moved to Montana, is that we actually had muskox here all the way down in Montana. Now, not our modern muskox that's right here, this very, very fluffy individual here. We had this more tall, skinny, not so hairy individual, and it's called a helmeted muskox. I've also heard woodland muskox, but it's a separate species than our modern one. One specimen from Blacktail Cave in Montana is around Helena, give or take a little bit, has been dated to 11,240 years. So they lived at least in Montana until about 11,000 years ago. And then they disappear somewhere around then. So Montana probably has some of the last of these muskox that were ever to live. They probably diverged from our modern muskox about 3 million years ago. And down here in Montana, although it's still the Ice Age, it was less physically demanding than, say, what Alaska was like during the Ice Age. And so that's why they have longer legs, they have less fluff, so they're less hardy, if you will. And this one seems to be the only ox that evolved in and remained in North America. So this is our local muskox. Didn't come over from Eurasia like our modern one did. Well, it did, but like a ways back. But this one evolved here and stayed here. We even had camels. We actually had a few camels. We had a lot of camels, actually. If you go back like 30 million years ago, we had a ton of camels. So if you were unfamiliar, camels evolved here in North America, spread about the world, and then went extinct in North America. So the whole world's camels can be traced back right here in North America. Camelops was probably the most widespread, and unfortunately, because humps are fatty tissues, they're very rarely preserved in the fossil record. So we're not sure if this had one hump, two humps, no humps. We're not exactly sure about the hump situation of yesterday's camel here, Camelops, but this one shows it with one little hump, and I guess this one kind of has a little baby hump right here. It appeared during the Middle Pliocene, so this pushes it back almost 4 million years ago that Camelops was around. And it also became extinct around 11,000 years ago. Yeah, all right. Now, this camel probably had legs that were about 20% longer than our modern camels, which if you've ever seen a camel in real life, they have really long legs already. And so it was probably about 7'7". So this shows it a little taller than that. These are in meters. And it probably weighed over 2,000 pounds. So it was a pretty big camel. And if you notice, we're going down in size. So I started at the biggest and we're working our way down to the smaller critters. Now, I couldn't find a better name for this horse, but it seems commonly it's called the Mexican horse. But this little equus was ranged so far. It went all the way from Mexico to Alberta, Canada. It was everywhere. There was probably another species of horse during this time, but it's really hard to tell with their remains what is just normal variance between a population and what's actually a different species. It seems like this genus in particular diverged around 10 to 5 million years ago, and it was extinct by about 15 years ago. So this is our little Montana horse, but it didn't last very long, I guess. So native horses, again, horses are just like camels. They evolved in North America, spread throughout the world, died out here in North America, and then the Spanish brought them back later. So native horses all became extinct in North America about 8,000 years ago. After 8,000 years ago, there was no more horses until about 500 years ago. Yes, and then this guy went extinct about 11,000 years ago. Yeah. Caribou. So this is something that I didn't know. Caribou and reindeer are basically the same thing. It just depends on where you're at. So if you call it a reindeer, you're in Eurasia. If you call it a caribou, you're in North America. So, caribou. But these two groups actually became isolated during the last glacial maximum when they could no longer cross the land bridge. So there is a little bit of difference between the two populations, but not like a ton of difference between them. The oldest fossil of a caribou is about 680,000 years ago. Old. 680,000 years old. So caribou have been on this planet for a while, and they basically look like this. There's no difference really between 10,000-year-old caribou bones and modern caribou bones. So they found a winning design. But they only became widespread about 100,000 years ago. That's where you kind of find all their stuff everywhere. And then, yeah, they became widespread about 100,000 years ago. Yep. And then they were everywhere by about 12,000 years ago. And reindeer, caribou, are the only cervid, so deer species, that females annually grow antlers to, which is kind of fun. It's the second largest of any extant deer. Their horns are, other than a male moose. So there you go. Fun facts about the caribou. We also had the Scimitar Cat. So unfortunately, the famous Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, never made it this far north. They liked it much warmer, farther south. But this guy, Homotherium, did spread out. This is the most widespread long-toothed cat that ever lived. So its sabers were about 4 inches long, which are not as long as the big saber-toothed cats, but they're still much longer than a modern big cat. Now, this genus diverged around 5 million years ago, and it became super widespread, like I said, and it even got down into Africa about 1.5 million years ago. So it was here and then went over and went down into Africa, which is crazy. And then it survived in Eurasia until about 28,000 years ago. So very, very widespread. Now, what's fun is that we think we know what it ate because of some fossils that we found and some shooting lasers at teeth and things like that. And we found that these guys usually avoided bone. So they liked the big fatty creatures because they don't want to break these teeth. These teeth are really, really important, so they shy away from bone. And it seems like they really, really liked young megafauna. In particular, baby mammoths, like a lot. We have found hordes of baby mammoth bones in Homotherium caves where they would have lived. Their teeth, the isotope in their teeth matches the isotopes in baby mammoths. So they were a baby mammoth specialist, which is kind of sad, but hey, scimitar cats need to eat too, right? Where am I? Yes, so they think that these guys were pretty quick on the ground, pretty strong up front, and they would actually chase down these mammoths, these little baby mammoths, and then drag them back to a cave. So if you've ever seen like a snow leopard trying to drag up a deer into their cave or something and it looks really tough, imagine also carrying a baby mammoth up into a cave to eat it. But it's pretty cool how much we have learned about just this cat from its fossils, being able to figure out how it hunted, where it lived, and what it liked to eat. The direwolf is fun because I think a lot of people, well, for one, they're not as big as Game of Thrones. Sorry, they're not. They're just not. They were a little smaller. They're actually just a smidgen bigger than a gray wolf. Now, for a very, very long time, researchers thought that direwolves and gray wolves, so the direwolves over in this picture are red, and then the gray wolves are gray. For a long time, we thought that they were descendants of one another. But it turns out that they are not. We did a lot of ancient DNA. We actually used some DNA from the La Brea tar pits and also Natural Trap Cave in Wyoming, which is about just two miles south of the Montana border. And we used their ancient DNA to map out their genome, and it turns out that they split from other living canids about 5.5 million years ago. And there is no evidence of gene flow between the gray wolves and the dire wolves, so they never intermingled. And this would be that means that dire wolves evolved here in North America. They were our actual native canids before gray wolves and coyotes moved in from Eurasia and probably outcompeted them. We think that dire wolves might have been more megafauna oriented with their foods. I mean, they evolved here in North America. They're used to our megafauna. And when the megafauna goes extinct, they weren't able to adapt to smaller prey and were probably outcompeted, like I said, with the coyotes and the gray wolves. Now, let's talk about us for a while. Humans. The timing of humans in North America is very tricky, and I actually just had to update this talk because some very cool new research has come out just this month. So this is brand new, hot off the press, if you will. So we know that they arrived from Northeast Asia across the Bering Land Bridge, and they probably moved through ice-free corridors. Now the question is, how many waves were there? And how many waves survived into our modern population? So here's the big new news right now. 38,000 years ago, we have found a mammoth butchering site in Colorado. And it has been dated, carbon dated to 38,000 years ago. That's really old. That's way older than we thought. Because the oldest, next evidence that we have is 23,000 years ago with the footprints in White Sands, New Mexico. That came out kind of during the pandemic. And then the oldest human bits and pieces is actually about 12,000 years ago with the Anzac Boy. And that's the only Clovis burial that we know of, and it's right here in Montana. So they've also done some really cool genomic work. So looking at modern populations and how our DNA has spread. And there seems to be evidence that human presence in North America or in the Americas started as early as 56,000 years ago. So if that's the case, if humans were moving into North America 56,000 years ago, then this 38,000 years ago tracks, right? It's like, oh yeah, sure, that's 20,000 years later than the earliest arrival time based on genetic evidence. So that could be switched a little bit here and there. Oh yes, I'll tell you a little bit more about the Anzac Boy. It was found in 1968. A construction worker discovered it, and there's over 100 stone tools and bone tools that were found near Wilsall, Montana? Wilsall? There we go, thank you. The artifacts were coated in red ochre, and it was of a young child, like a 2-year-old little boy. And this is the oldest known burial in North America. And it's the only burial that the tools belong to the Clovis culture. And this is the only burial known related to the Clovis people as well. So in 2014, some controversial genetic work was done on this little boy, and it showed that he was more closely related to Native Americans than any other group worldwide. He was reburied in 2014, shortly after that genetic. But nobody asked anybody if they could do it. That's why it's a little controversial. So if we look at just oldest Paleo-Indian sites in the Americas, it pushes us back into the 16,000 range. So we've got some sites in Texas that are 16,000 years old. Idaho's got some 16,000-year-old sites. 14,500 years ago in Chile. So that means there were probably people here a lot earlier than 14,000 years ago, of course. Oregon about 14,000 years ago, and 13,000 years ago in the Channel Islands of California. So we've got a lot of sites in the 16-ish thousand range, but we're starting to find more evidence that there were a lot more humans here a lot earlier. So I want to show you this graph. And this graph is showing bison over time. So these little dots here are showing some information with bison. But humans like to eat cows, right? So we were probably following the cows wherever they went. Now this shows what this area would have looked like before 23,000 years ago. And you can see there's a lot of space to go around. You could travel all over the place before 23,000 years ago. Then was the last glacial maximum. It was pretty locked down, unless you had to go along the coast, but that would have been pretty rough traveling if you couldn't go inland at all. And then here's this 13,000 time with the corridors. So for a really long time, we were like, oh, there's no humans in North America before 13,000. And then it was pushed back to 16,000 because we found human remains that were 16,000 years old. And now we're starting to think that there were earlier waves that came down before 23,000 years ago. But the question is, did those people give any genetic information to modern populations? Did they make it? Did they die out? So that's a bigger question that we have yet to answer. So we know that all those animals don't exist anymore. So what happened? Well, they went extinct. Now, the main thing is that, there's my little thing. 82% of the megafauna worldwide went extinct. So not just here in North America, but Australia, Africa, Eurasia, all of it went. And here in North America, we had 38 genera that went extinct, so genus, that went extinct. Now, 5 of those are small. They're not actually megafauna, but 5 small mammals also went extinct during this time. 18 of these species are known to have survived up until Clovis arrived. So 18 species were on the menu for Clovis people. Now, that leaves 15 that disappeared before them, so you can't point fingers at humans really with this one yet. Well, maybe, right? We could have had some more. But there's only 5 species. We have 16 Clovis kill sites, either kill or scavenge sites. And there's only 5 species that we know that they actually ate and like killed and or scavenged. And that's mammoths, mastodons, gomphotheres, which I didn't mention, horses, and camels. So there's a lot of other things that I showed you that went extinct during this time than things that Clovis ate. So again, it's kind of pushing back against this overkill hypothesis. Now, what I found fascinating when I was researching this is that most of the overkill sites represent fauna that survived to the present. So like the bison kill out near Lewistown, the buffalo jump. Elk and moose. Those are usually the species that we find at overkill sites. Not mammoths, not mastodons, not horses, not camels. So again, this is pushing back on this, well, humans destroy everything, which is probably true. But in this case, I don't think that it was humans were the smoking gun. The big one was climate. So we had some dramatic fluctuations in climate during this time. And the species that go extinct lived in all sorts of environments. It wasn't just, oh, these ones here, the high elevation ones. No, it was species that lived all over North America, and they went extinct at different times. So as I was talking about all those extinction events, some of them went extinct upwards of 18, 20,000 years ago. Some of them held on until 4,000 years ago. So it wasn't like a line was drawn in the sand and said, no, you shall not pass, megafauna. It was a slow death of the megafauna, but it was probably due to rapid changes in climate that these animals could not adapt to. They couldn't move fast enough. They couldn't migrate to better places. Or these climate situations happened during really important times in the life cycle of an animal, mainly baby making season. So if you all of a sudden prevent a bunch of animals from making more babies or kill off all of their babies of one generation, it gets pretty tough after that to stay alive. So climate was probably the big one. Humans definitely had some pressure on a few species, but we are not the end-all be-all of megafauna. All right, so let's get into the geology. So this is going to be a whole bunch of pretty pictures of Glacier National Park, basically. So let's see what kinds of landscapes glaciers create. So these two are some really fun little diagrams of what you can get with a glacier. So whenever the ice starts to melt and retreat, so it's going back, it's not growing anymore, you get these weird things called drumlins, which I'm going to talk about because I love them. This is my favorite glacial feature. You get braided streams and these kettles and moraines, all sorts of cool stuff. And then this one kind of shows you what it looks like during glaciation and then the same area without the glacier, right? So you get these wonderful U-shaped valleys. You can get these cirque glaciers, all sorts of fun things that are happening. Horns, ariettes, cirques. We're going to look at all these in more detail. So let's start with a moraine, because this one's probably the easiest to see because Polson is one. So all of Polson is the terminal moraine, the end moraine of the flathead lobe of the ice sheet that came down. So it pushed, it's like a bulldozer, and it pushes all the sediment and dirt and everything up in front of it and builds this giant mound. So that is the moraine. That's all the junk at the front of that ice sheet lobe. And then the ice sheet retreated and left the junk pile behind. And so Polson's on a junk pile. Sorry, Polson. So this is a really nice moraine that you can see. But also, right here, we have this ice margin moraine. So just like a lot of our glacial lakes in eastern Montana, we get these little lakes that can form in the front of an ice sheet. And that little lake happens to be Lake Mary Ronan. So Lake Mary Ronan is a remnant of a little ice marginal lake. So if you've ever been up there, know that you are standing in the remnant of an ice sheet. Same thing when you drive over Polson. Here's our beautiful U-shaped valleys. Both of these pictures are from Glacier, off of Going to the Sun Road. You've probably got exactly this same shot in your house somewhere. But this U-shaped valley you can see here and here. And so that's when that big ice lobe comes down and just smooths all the rough surfaces as it comes through. So U-shaped valleys are probably some of the easiest to identify. So if you think about Missoula Valley, how we just kind of down to the river in a nice V shape, if you're ever driving anywhere and it's a nice smooth U-shaped valley, you'll know that a glacier went through there at one time. Ariettes, this is the garden wall in Glacier National Park. And so an ariette is this thin area that, like this jagged crest here. This is what I'm talking about. It's like a serrated knife edge. And it once separated two adjacent glaciers. So as the glaciers came down, there's a rock wall in the middle, and it just wears down on this rock wall for a really long time. And every once in a while, the ice actually breaks through in a couple places. But otherwise, you have this really knife edge, and that's where two ice sheets were rubbing together with a little rock wall in the middle. This is Flinch Peak in Glacier National Park. I told you there's going to be a lot of glacier pictures. There are other places that you can see glacial features, but you know, they're not named Glacier National Park. So this is an example of a horn. So this is when you have at least 3 ice sheets coming together and basically just sharpening this point. It makes it kind of look like a pyramid usually. But this is a really great example of one. And cirques and tarns. So the tarn is the lake, and the cirque is this bowl-shaped feature that ice will form. So ice kind of gets in there, and it kind of cruises around, and it kind of just erodes out a little bowl in these mountain valleys. And then that can fill with ice, and this is Iceberg Lake in Glacier. So if you ever hike up there to Iceberg Lake, know that you're standing in a cirque, and that amount of water is called a tarn. Birdwoman Falls, it's right here, is a great example of a waterfall coming out of a hanging valley. So what you have is a secondary glacier coming down here. So you can see this nice U-shaped valley, but here's the main glacier in this big U-shaped valley. So you have a secondary glacier coming in, and it basically terminates as it gets into the big glacier. But when everything melts away, you're left with this hanging valley wall. It's just like a wall that goes to nowhere, kind of. And that was created by a secondary glacier coming out. But Birdwoman Falls is coming off of that hanging valley. Kettles are a lot of fun too. So as an ice sheet is retreating, it can leave chunks of ice behind. Now, as we all know, big chunks of ice take forever to thaw and melt. And that's exactly what happens, is that it takes so long that the sediment actually covers it, then it finally erodes, and then that sediment collapses and leaves a little depression, and usually water fills in. So you get these little kettle lakes. So this is 9 pipes. And you'll notice that there are a lot of circles, a lot of circles. So we think that most of 9 pipes and all of the little puddles and things, especially these round circles, were created by kettles as the flathead lobe retreated. This would have been an earlier lobe that came down the Piedmont, I believe. Pinedale. The Pinedale glaciation, which was a bit older. It was about 100,000 years old versus like the 20,000 years. That probably created the 9 pipes area. There are a few people that don't think that these are kettles. They have another idea, but I'm going to go with kettle because they look like a kettle. And at first, most people thought that they were kettles, and kettles also look exactly like this. So the other idea, I didn't write down. I was like, I'm just going to roll with it. But if you're wondering, I got this picture from the newest edition of Roadside Geology of Montana, and they mention in that book the other idea, if these aren't kettles, what they are. So highly encourage everybody to buy that book if you don't have it. Drumlins. These are my favorite. They're so weird. They're so weird. And we still aren't 100% sure how they're formed. We have a really good idea. I'm going to show a video here in just a second and kind of give you an idea. But they form in these swarms. And you can see this is kind of their shape. This is up near Eureka. And it's the only place in Montana that you can find drumlins. And this is not the best quality photo. I apologize for that. So Canada, US, and this is the Eureka drumlin field. If you ever get a chance to go up and see these things, it's on my summer list this year to go up and see these drumlins. You can kind of see them from the air here. But they create these swarms of these weird like hill shapes. It seems like somebody just like pulled the sediment out. And for a long time we thought that's how they were formed. All right, everybody cross your fingers. All right, so it's working, hooray. So here's an ice sheet. And it's moving slowly, it's coming this way. And there's always water underneath an ice sheet. So that's lubing up the surface so the ice can slide across the rock. Now, a bunch of stuff gets caught up in the bottom of a glacier, and as this water comes, it drops it down. But then that creates a barrier that the water has to go up and over. And so it keeps going up and over, and more rock comes out of it, and it's got to go up and over again. And so you can see how that drumlin is starting to form under the ice sheet. So we used to think that they just like smashed into something and then squished it out. But it seems like it's way more complicated than that. So again, the water is just going up and over and carving out the bottom of that ice sheet as it's moving over. So you can see this blue is slowly moving to the right. Left, my left, this way. So it's still moving over as all this junk is coming out of the bottom of the glacier.
Would be accurate that the larger kind of rocks or sediment be on that?
Not necessarily, but he was asking if the larger rocks would always be over on this side, generally. Maybe, maybe not. It's more of that water hitting. So anytime water hits a barrier, it slows down and it drops whatever it's carrying. And in this case, it's carrying a bunch of sediment, but it's also working up into the bottom of the glacier. And we know that glaciers hold on to a bunch of stuff as they move across the surface. And so you'll get some big ones back here, you get some big ones back here, but it's mainly, this is the first spot that the water hits. And then that will drop out first, and then it has to go up and over. Again, this is all pretty theoretical, but this is the best one that I've seen on how these are formed. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. All right, now glacial erratics. So just like on that last video, you saw all the stuff at the bottom of the ice sheet. So glaciers carry a lot, and sometimes they can be gigantic boulders. And every once in a while, that ice can actually cave icebergs. So here in Glacial Lake, Missoula, this is one of our erratics right here on U of M's campus. So this boulder was dropped by an iceberg that used to be in Glacial Lake, Missoula. Now there are some other erratics in the state, but this picture was taken in Yellowstone, so technically it's Wyoming. But a lot of times what gives an erratic away is you have these giant boulders and there's nowhere for them to come from. You don't have a giant mountain that's dropping boulders onto the highway or anything. I mean, this is pretty open. Where'd those rocks come from? Same thing with campus. Where would a giant rock like this come from? And it's been there ever since before campus was there, right? So that's usually how you can spot an erratic, is there's a big giant rock, and sometimes it doesn't match any of the rock around you. And it's just kind of thrown out in a field. And those are usually glacial erratics. I've seen some in Kansas that were there in the time of the buffalo, and the buffalo would scratch up on them. And they did that for so long that certain sides of these rocks are completely polished, almost in like a mirror surface. And they were all polished by the side, probably the butt, actually, of a bison. Here in Missoula, Strand Lines are probably our most visible glacial feature, and right before we got all this new snow, you could see them really great. Usually mid-February is like the perfect time to see these Strand Lines. So what happens is each time Glacial Lake Missoula fills, that shoreline cuts into the side of the mountain. Mount Sentinel is really easy to see them. You can see them on Mount Jumbo too. Usually it happens when you have a little bit of a melt, and the high spots melt off, but the low spots keep the ice. So then you can see them really nice and clear. Like I said, 2 days ago it was perfect. We could have just looked at them out the window. Now it looks like an ice cream cone again. Now each one of these strand lines represents a shoreline. So we think that after Glacial Lake Missoula filled the first time, it never filled as deep as the time before. And each time was a little less catastrophic. You got less and less and less coming down. Other ideas is just that it hung out a little longer at certain layers and cut into the mountain as it filled, well, not as it lowered, because that was catastrophic and it went poof like that. So these would have been fill lines up the side of the mountain. So here is the deepest of Glacial Lake Missoula. Here's University of Montana. Here's Montana Natural History Center. And so if you've ever seen the bumper stickers bring back Glacial Lake Missoula, that's what it would be like. So not a lot of people would enjoy that, but Mount Sentinel would be like its own little island, which is kind of fun to think about. And probably the coolest feature of all are giant ripple marks. These were created by the Glacial Lake Missoula floods that came out, and for a really long time, there were a lot of geologists that argued about these, a lot. But finally, we got aerial photographs. And it's pretty easy to tell what those are, especially if you're coming from about 10,000 feet. So these are the Camas Prairie ripple marks, and they are the largest ripple marks in the entire world. So if you ever get a chance to go out to Camas Prairie, then you can tell all your friends, I have seen the largest ripple marks in the entire world, because that's what they are. Now, the channeled scablands in Washington are also very similar, but ours are bigger here in Montana. And with that, I just want to let you know that I wrote a book. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's Tales of the Prehistoric World. It's for kids, but everybody that loves ancient life should read it because it's a lot of fun. And if you want to get it in town, there are signed copies at both Fact and Fiction and the Montana Natural History Center, or you can buy it online, basically wherever books are sold. And with that, I thank you. Whoa, I'm thirsty. All right, you guys got any questions? We got some time for questions. Yeah.
I wanted to let the audience know that out beyond the Y, on your way to Polson, to your right, and I don't know if it's by that little campsite there, whatever they call that, but wherever the road cuts through the railroad line that runs up there, there's a big bank. And in that bank are fossilized leaves from, the deciduous leaves that had fallen to the bottom of the lake and then got pressed in the mud, and they're very hard.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy to see. Of course, we haven't been up there for 50 years, but
there are some cool features that you can see from Glacial Lake Missoula. If you're going on 90 to the west, I believe, and you come around a really tight corner, and on the left-hand side, it looks like the rocks go red, white, red, white, red, white, red, 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 white. In that road cut, those are all sediment deposits from Glacial Lake Missoula. So anytime the water wasn't coming out of the valley and kind of got in some chill zones, some off-the-way valleys. The water would slow down and the sediment would have a chance to actually fall out of the water instead of just away, and it just took everything with it. And in those cases, in those little side valleys, we can actually see some deposition from the water from Glacial Lake Missoula. I didn't know that those plants were part of Glacial Lake Missoula. As far as I know, nobody's been able to like specifically say yay
Also,
or
you
nay.
know of them then.
Yeah. But yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah. What about the fauna during that kind of stuff? But what about the ecosystem that kind of was advantageous for megafauna grassland?
Yep, so his question was, what was so great about this area for megafauna? Like, why was there so much megafauna here? So it's mostly grassland. So in front of those ice sheets, it was like a Siberian tundra. And the ground was constantly turned and tilled by the millions of feet that went across it, whether it be bison or camels or any of the elephants. So all of those species that I mentioned are all grazers. So it was just a whole bunch of grass as far as the eye can see. And it was cool. A lot of times colder weather can build more hardier, bigger mammals. So for example, our white-tailed deer up here in Montana are bigger than the white-tailed deer in Kansas. And that's just because our white-tailed deer have to deal with way colder weather than the ones south. So usually, sometimes, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but a lot of times when we find colder, more northern environments, you get larger animals that also live in it. Yeah. Is there a question? Did you have a question back there? No? Any other questions? Yeah.
Many years ago, I went to a lecture by David Alt, and there were two things that struck me from that. I'd ask you to comment on them.
Okay.
One was, what happened to the southern end of the Mission Mountains? And the other one was that the South Hills here are, I don't know the term, maybe it's a moraine, but he said if we have a really big earthquake, that would all liquefy.
Yes and no. Okay, so the southern portion of the Missions, they talk about that in the newest edition of the Roadside Geology of Montana. I didn't know I was going to get this question tonight, or I would have brushed up on it. I feel like it's a fault. Something happened, there was a fault, offset it or something. I can't remember.
It was nobody knows what happened to the southern end of the Missions.
I bet we've made some progress. I bet there's been some hypotheses now. I'm pretty sure that's mentioned in the new Roadside Geology book because they talk about the missions quite a bit in that book. The second one, at least on this side of the South Hills, this is bedrock. Yes. Farther down though, no. And also like on the dump side, on the north side, you can actually see the remnants of a landslide from Waterworks Hill. So if you're looking at Waterworks Hill to the north, you can tell off to your left and right, you can see the Strand Lines, and then all of a sudden it gets lumpy. And that was a landslide right there. So you can really see a nice landslide. I'm not exactly sure how old that landslide is. Now, with earthquakes, what they can do is called liquefaction. And so as that vibration happens, it does this really cool phenomenon with sediment and water, and it basically turns it into like a sludge. So you go from a solid surface to quicksand, basically, which is pretty cool. However, it would take a pretty big earthquake to do that up here. I mean, there was the Lincoln earthquake a few years ago, and that was about a 5.0 here in Missoula. And that's with the epicenter still being an hour away. And it didn't do any liquefaction. There might have been a few areas of offset here and there, but not a big one. Now, there has been some really big ones that we have evidence for in Missoula Valley that have offset rocks over 10 feet. And that would have been a very big earthquake, a scary big earthquake. An earthquake that would definitely take the Clap building down that was built for earthquakes. So that's the building I work in. It's awful. But we do have some evidence of some really, really big ones here in Missoula, and that might be big enough to liquefy some of the hills around us, but it would probably cause more of big major landslides. Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly when the date was that earthquake hit Challis, Idaho, maybe 30 years ago?
84.
84. I remember sitting watching the Today Show, and pretty soon my head was just swimming in a circle. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, but it was later explained that everything in the Missoula Valley was in fact kind of like Cheerios in a bowl.
Yeah, you get those P waves and S waves coming through. Those are the waves. I remember for some reason I couldn't sleep the night of the Lincoln earthquake, and I went out to sleep on the couch because it was hot and I don't have air conditioning. And so as soon as I fluffed my blanket for the couch, it started, and I knew exactly what was happening. I've never experienced an earthquake before. I was so excited. And so I just stood there, and I shut my eyes, and I could feel the floorboards. I could feel the waves moving through the floorboards, and our chandelier was moving and everything. We used to live right up against Mount Sentinel, and I think that fault line goes through. And so if the closer you were to Mount Sentinel, the more severe you felt the shaking. But it was one of the most exciting nights ever. Scared my husband, though. He's not a geologist. I was just like, did you feel it? Oh, my God. What was that? 2018, 2019? Something like that, right? Somewhere? Yeah. Yep, the Lincoln one. No, it wasn't that long ago at all. The bars in Lincoln lost a lot of liquor that day. Rest in peace. Any other questions? Did I get everything right, Glacial Lake, Missoula? Does it sound okay? Do you have any corrections?
I'm going to comment on his leaves and your landslide.
Okay.
We have a little chip of an odd little early tertiary formation, separate from different.
Yeah, the Renova.
Stuff around here. And in that formation, there's some really interesting stuff, but in terms of landslides and landfills and your leaves, there's lake bottom material that contains both coal, that's where our coal mine is from, and some Montmorillonitic clays, and you juice those up. If they get really wet, you really don't need an earthquake. And the big slide up on the hill, there is some thought that at least part of that slide movement may have been Lake Missoula saturating those clay beds.
Could be.
And then you saturate the hillside, drain off Lake Missoula. Lake Missoula is no longer helping to hold up the hillside, and those clay layers let her rest.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
But your fossils, your leaf fossils are in there. Those fossils are a lot older than Lake Missoula.
Yeah. So right next to the dump, if you guys are unfamiliar, there used to be a small little coal mining operation right next to the dump. And within those layers are known as the Renova Formation, and everywhere else in the state, there's amazing fossils that come out of them. For whatever reason here, there's no fossils, except for these plant fossils. Now, you cannot go up there to that area and collect those plant fossils because it's all on private land. So I've been trying to get in touch with the landowners that, of course, don't live in Montana to get access to that site to collect some of those plants, because I have some really early 1900s records of them, and it states what species they're there and all sorts of stuff. They're very fragile, so you have to take like a consolidant out with you because they basically just disintegrate as soon as you touch them or look at them wrong. But those are about 15 to 30 million years old, give or take a couple mil here and there. But that's the Renova Formation. That's the north side hills. This way. North side hills. Yeah.
At the landfill, I'm not sure what they're called, but they look like a clay ball, but their heart is a rock, but they're dug right out of the clay.
Yeah, those are called concretions, and it usually has to do with the variation of minerals within that clay bed. So you get areas of more dense that kind of pull together, and you get these concretions that form out of it. Sometimes concretions have fossils in the middle of them. Sometimes they're just rocks. But all right. Any other questions? Are we done? All right. Thanks so much.